Welcome back to the Deeper 2025 podcast. We're so excited you're with us today. And today we're going to look at Acts 22. Let me remind you before we jump into Acts 22, if you like these videos, if they're helpful, please like them. Please subscribe to our channel. We want to make sure that we are making an impact with you as you read through this daily reading plan we've got here at New Shores. But Acts 22, Paul shares his testimony. And sometimes we think when people share their testimony, it ought to be received well. People ought to just smile and be happy. But here in Acts 22, Paul is actually sharing his testimony in front of an angry crowd. And if you remember the story of Paul, it really tells us a lot about our story and how God can use us no matter where we have come from. His testimony is powerful. If you remember, he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. And as he's going along to Damascus, he was a persecutor of Christians. And as he is walking there, he's blinded by a light, and it's Jesus that meets him. And Jesus is in the sky, and he says, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul has an encounter with Jesus that day, and his life changes forever. He's blinded until he gets to Damascus. Jesus tells him where to go so that he can get his sight back. And even the believers in Damascus, Paul had such a reputation, they didn't believe him at first, that he had this conversion experience and he now was a Jesus follower. And so the first thing I want us to see in Acts 22 is your past doesn't disqualify you. Some of you have past that they're very checkered. You can sometimes believe the lie that because you have this checkered past, that God could never use you, that God could never use your story to share with others about his love for them. But Paul here is a prime example that it doesn't matter where we've come from. It doesn't matter how far against God we were or how far away from God we went, that God wants to use you and he wants to use me to share the story of the good news of Jesus with other people. Paul was a persecutor. He murdered Christians. Like, he was a murderer. And God uses Paul to be the greatest missionary, greatest evangelist ever to walk the planet. But also we see that a personal encounter with Jesus changes everything. I said not too long ago to someone I was talking to, you will know when you have a personal experience with Jesus. In fact, I believe it was in a sermon. I said, when you have an experience with Jesus, you will not go back. You cannot go back. So a personal encounter with Jesus changes everything. And so I would just ask you this question: how has Jesus changed your life? Has Jesus changed your life? I'm not talking about a set of rules or religion that you've chosen to follow, that you go to church every Sunday, or you go to church every Sunday. When I was growing up, it was Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. That was the true test if you were really a Christian or not, if you went all 3 times. I'm not talking about those things. I'm saying, have you had an encounter with Jesus? Because a personal encounter with Jesus changes everything. It changes absolutely everything. So how has Jesus changed your life? How has he transformed your life? But here's probably the most important part of this story. So we've seen that your past doesn't disqualify you. We've seen that a personal encounter with Jesus changes everything. But probably the thing I really want to drive home with you today as you listen is that your story can lead others to Christ. Your individual personal testimony, your individual story of how you came to Christ can lead others to Christ. Just as Paul was a witness here in Acts 22, just as Paul spent time sharing his story, God calls us to share our story, and he wants you to share your story. So who in your life needs to hear how Jesus has transformed and changed your life? Who in your life? Maybe it's someone in your family. Maybe it's a neighbor across the street. Maybe it's a neighbor next door. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's a close friend. I'm not sure in your life who God wants you to share Jesus with, but I know that all of us have people in our life that need an encounter, a personal encounter with Jesus. And so who is it that God is leading you to share your story with? You should pray for opportunities to share your story with that person. You should pray that when you do get the opportunity to share the story, that number one, you would have courage and boldness to share your story. And number two, that they would respond in a positive way to what you're sharing. Paul shares his testimony with an angry crowd, Sometimes I think that scares us. We think when we share our testimony with a friend or a family member or a relative, coworker, that it's going to be refuted. It's going to be looked at with anger and with disgust. But no matter how it's looked at and no matter how those people receive it, our job is simply to share. And so you share the good news with people in your life as God gives you opportunities. Pray for those people to respond, and you'll be a lot like Paul, and you'll become a great evangelist for the faith.